Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the annual Vermont Emergency Management and Partners Spring Flood and Ice Jam Seminar. My name is Emily Harris, and I'm the Engagement Section Chief at Vermont Emergency Management. The purpose of today's session is to provide local jurisdictions and regional entities with information about the conditions that may result in spring flooding, as well as proactive measures they can take to prepare for, respond to, and recover from such events. So our agenda for today, we will first hear from National Weather Service, then we'll have a presentation from Vermont Emergency Management. We'll then take a brief bio break before we hear from the Vermont Agency of Transportation, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont National Guard, Division of Fire Safety, and then the Regional Planning Commissions. First, allow me to introduce John Goff from the National Weather Service. He'll be discussing spring flood outlook and inform decision makers about flooding causes and potential mitigation efforts. Take it away, John.
Good afternoon, Emily, and everybody. Can everybody hear me? Is my sound okay?
Your sound is good, John.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining me. Again, my name is John Goff. I'm a lead meteorologist here at the National Service in Burlington, Vermont. I'll be giving the presentation today with my colleague Maureen Hastings, giving it tomorrow for the second iteration of these meetings. And I'm going to go over a little bit of a review of the types of flooding caused by open water flooding, ice jam flooding to start the presentation. And in the last part of the presentation, I'll talk about the current conditions across our area and our current flood forecasts for the season. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So this is the overall outline for the presentation. Again, the winter spring flood climatology of our area, time of year. I'll go over causes of flooding during the spring and winter for that matter, and I'll go over a couple of more recent events that have happened in our area over the past few years. Then we'll move on to a current recap of our current winter, and then talk about the overall spring flood outlook in terms of the long term, which is right now running below normal. All right, next slide, please. So when we talk about winter spring flood climatology, the most common dates are usually the later half of February through about mid-April. They can occur at any time during the year, but those are the most common, that's the most common kind of time frame. And those are usually due to snowmelt and heavy rainfall, or just heavy rainfall only if we don't have a lot of snow, especially during late season events if most of the snow is melted. You can have some early season flooding, usually during January or late December. Usually those are results of freeze-up type of ice jam type of scenarios. January 2018 was the combination of both, and I'll go over one of those events for you. And there are some just lists of more recent notable spring flooding. We had the flooding back in last December on the Otter Creek, mainly a southern Vermont thing. And then some other notable events, usually about every year or so, some type of minor to moderate event, in rare cases major event that has occurred. Multiple or midwinter events are becoming more common as the winters in Vermont are becoming more changeable over time. Next slide. So let's go through two different events. If you joined us last year, we highlighted these two events as well, but I wanted to go over them because they are good examples of the type of events we can see here. One is a mid-season, when I mean mid-season, midwinter, heavy rain, snow melt, ice jam type event back in 2018 in January. And I'll also briefly go over an end of year type of event in April of 2019 where we had thunderstorms and a total loss of the residual snowpack across our area. Next slide. So the first event was the January 13 through 15, 2018 flooding. We had widespread 1 to 2 inches of rainfall, and we lost about 8 to 16 inches of snow depth, which was an equivalent of about 1 to 2 additional inches of water. So when you add that together, it was about a 2 to 4 inch rainfall snowmelt event. So some of the snowpack did remain, but we lost a lot of it. And this is just a map showing the overall rainfall measured, not the snowfall across our area. So you can see widespread 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches in local areas up to about 2 inches in certain isolated points. Some of the flooding was mainly due to ice jams, and you can see a list in the little legend there on the left. Some of the main rivers, Missisquoi, Winooski, Lamoille, Passumpsic, the Mad, the New Haven, and in portions of the Connecticut. Next slide, please. And so just a few shots. The basic lead up to this event was a record cold in the early few weeks of January. So we had a normal to above normal snowpack accumulating, and then we had a rapid thaw with that rainfall. So these are just some shots along some of the main northern rivers and the resulting ice breakup and ice jam flooding, just some various shots. The Lamoille River in Johnson, you can see that picture at upper right there. The Sterling Market there, right by the river, was severely flooded. Several businesses impacted. Next slide. So as we go on and look, the second event was April of 2019, just about 5 months later. And this is one of those late season events where we had really lost all the ice, but there still was residual snowpack in the higher elevations. And we had convective thunderstorm type rainfall across especially southern and eastern Vermont. Anytime you have really mild weather with thunderstorms and torrential rain on snowpack, it leads to bad things. So we had this corridor of 1.5 to 3 inches of convective rainfall across southern and eastern Vermont, as shown by the map there. And then about 8 to 16 inches of snow depth totally lost from the higher elevations, which put in about 2 to 3 inches additional of liquid water into the rivers and streams. So a significant event. When you add those two up, you're looking at 3.5 to 6 inches of water being thrown into those streams in about the period of about 12 hours. Primarily open water flooding, and mainly the Otter Creek was the most impacted by this event. It did touch major flood level, just touched it. We also had some additional minor to locally moderate flooding on the Winooski, Passumpsic, and Wells River watersheds, and there was some flash flooding noted. Next slide, please. So this is just a graphic of that event showing the total modeled snowmelt. We do have models that depict how much snow will be lost in addition to the rainfall we forecast. So when we work with the National Remote Hydrological Sensing Center out in Minneapolis and our National Northeastern River Forecast Center in Boston that does a lot of our river forecasts for us, and we work with them, these type of maps we look at very closely during snowmelt type of scenarios. So as you can see, they were modeling about 2 to 3 inches of snowmelt going into the rivers on top of the rainfall we were forecasting. Okay, go ahead, please. Next slide.
It should be showing 14-15 April 2019. Are you viewing that?
Yep, I got it now. I just switched. Thanks.
Perfect.
There's a little bit of a delay. It's not a big deal though. So this is just another depiction of that, inches of water equivalent, and you can see how much was lost in there and was melted. Just another way to look at that. So 2 to 3 inches of localized 5 inches of water equivalent melted into the streams. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a map from Vermont Emergency Management showing general impacts by district from the high water from that event. So there was significant damage to roads and bridges, especially as you can see there across southern and eastern Vermont. Anything in the orange to red ranged from minor to major infrastructure damage, and the little stars there were road closures. So you can kind of see the purple stars were state road closures. And then the little boxes, the larger boxes, the green boxes and the red box there were flash and aerial flood warnings issued by the National Weather Service. And so as a result of this, FEMA did have a federal disaster declared for several counties in southern and in the eastern portions of Vermont. I believe that's still an active disaster assistance thing ongoing from emergency management perspective. That's DR 4445. Next slide, please. And this is just a map I pulled from an older map from FEMA. I believe these are still the correct counties that were affected. I'm not 100% positive if Caledonia was in that DR, but you can see mainly southern and eastern Vermont was who was affected by this late season flooding in April 2019. All right, next slide, please. Just some snapshots of that event. You can see not a lot of ice on the rivers. It's all open water flooding. You can see in the on the upper right photograph, there's still some residual snowpack in a little bit of the woods there in western Vermont. That's a little bit higher elevations of Windsor County. You can see White River at Stockbridge, the White River at Royalton. There's a Killington water rescue ongoing. That's courtesy of the Rutland Herald. So some significant areas of flooding during that event. Okay, so let's talk about winter spring flood causes. When we talk about and when we look at forecasting flooding, what gives us the most confidence that flooding is going to occur are mainly about rainfall. If you have mild days and the sun just melts the snow away gradually, even if it's very mild, 50s and 60s, the snow does not melt rapidly enough in general to cause a lot of widespread flooding. You can get high water, you can get some minor nuisance issues, but to get the big higher end ice jam breakup or really open water, moderate to major flooding, you need heavy rain either with or without snowpack. That's kind of the bottom line. So when I talk about precursors, if you have an above normal snowpack and you have heavy rainfall falling on it, you have a lot of water in that snowpack, then it certainly raises concern. Do you have substantial ice thickness, not just thin ice? Ice thickness is greater than a foot, for example. And so it's always this race between melting out the snow, breaking up the ice, and hopefully getting through a winter where you don't have an event where you're doing that at the same time that you're getting heavy rainfall. So in terms of the causative events, you want a significant warm up promoting snowmelt to increase your water flows. You want heavy rainfall, moderate to heavy rainfall on top of that snow to melt it. And you want those rises in those creeks to rise enough so that it can break up the ice. Next slide, please. So there's a couple type of main ice jams and ice out scenarios. We talk about a thermal meltout scenario and then a mechanical breakup scenario. There's two different main kinds. Okay, go ahead, please. First of all, I've got this slide here. These are just a pie graph and a map of Vermont showing recorded ice jams. This is from the Cold Regions Research Lab. It's Army Corps of Engineers facility. The Northeastern Regional Office is down in Hanover, New Hampshire. That covers most of New England. And you can see that there's a variety of causes, a variety of events that occur through the years. But if you look, January, February, March are by far the most. If you look at April and May and December, they're not as common in general, at least for ice jams. We talked about that April 2019 event just a bit ago, but that was not an ice event. It was just a heavy rainfall event. So when we talk about ice jams in particular, mainly it's these mid to late winter type of events. And if you look at the map on the left, the larger the red dots are the more recorded events. So I've highlighted a lot of the northern river sheds to show that a lot of those are very susceptible. We certainly can get ice jams down in southern Vermont as well. They just don't happen quite as regularly on as widespread a basis as in the northern watersheds. For example, if you look at the Otter Creek in Rutland, there's not as many ice jam ice out scenarios on that. The water in the Otter Creek, a lot of the reach of the Otter Creek, it doesn't flow that fast, so you don't have a lot of ability to break ice up in a big way. A lot of times it just melts out. So I just wanted to show you those two maps, mainly mid to late winter for ice jam breakups and focused generally across northern watersheds more than southern watersheds. Next slide. Okay, talking about thermal meltouts, this is where the ice just melts out in place. You don't have a mechanical breaking up of the ice where the river is rising really fast. And so what typically happens as you get into March, especially say past mid-March, is you have mild sunny days, you have cool sub-freezing type nights. Think of maple sugaring weather. They last multiple days in a row. It's a long duration gradual warmth with no significant rainfall. The ice cover thins, it weakens and melts in place, or forms minor jams. And the one thing I probably should have highlighted in this slide, the biggest role that makes the ice weaken and melt out in place is sunshine. It's much more of a bigger thing than say if it's 65 degrees out. The increasing sun angle as you get through late winter and into the early part of spring is increasingly higher, and just the solar radiation alone acts to rot the ice, break up the ice crystal bonds within the ice, and it tends just to rot away, crumble away, and melt. Certainly warmer temperatures helps, but you have to remember the water that the ice is sitting on is extremely cold. And so the radiation from the sun is the big player. And so you start to develop these open channels gradually, and then as the open channels form, it gradually serves as a focal point to melt the ice out. There are some mitigation efforts by communities that have been taken in the past during the meltout season in the absence of a discrete big ice jam breakup effect. And that can be things like putting leaf debris, dark type of debris on the ice that will heat the ice up and melt it. And sometimes even getting special permits to put public wastewater effluent into the creeks. Some of these issues were addressed by Montpelier about 10 years ago when we had a pretty big ice jam on the cemetery bend there. And those efforts can be useful. And those are usually held by BEM in conjunction with local and county type constituencies with input from the public on the best way forward, because these things do cost money, but sometimes it's in the best interest of communities to try to work toward preventing something from happening if there's an existing ice jam in place or something like that. All right, next slide, please. Next is the mechanical breakup. This is when you have significant ice thickness, an extended period of freezing temperatures with limited thawing. Think of ice thicknesses greater than a foot. And then you have a sudden increase in river flow, usually from just heavy rainfall alone or rainfall and snowmelt, like I've talked before in some of those events. You get the ice to break up or water running over the ice, and then you get these big breakup events that can lead to existing ice, cramming into existing ice jams that are already in place from earlier, or causing a new ice jam. One of the general rules of thumb, and this is just a very generic rule of thumb, but it tends to act pretty well, is you want about a 3 times river rise the thickness of the ice to get the ice to break up physically. The ice is very elastic, so on an ice covered river, it will tend to bow and crack, but it doesn't necessarily give away until you get a significant enough rise. And typically that's about 3 times the thickness of the ice. So just think of it pretty simply. If you have a foot of river ice, you want a 3-foot river rise to probably break that ice up. If it's a deep cold winter and it's 18 inches thick, then you want even more than that. 3 times 18, whatever that is. 50 and 4 feet, 5-foot rise on the rivers. So a lot of times the ice will stop moving and block a channel at a jam site. And ice will jam up in a variety of scenarios. Usually it occurs during a change of slope in the river, where the river is steep and flattens out, where the current slows down, where it runs into an intact, thicker ice sheet or a place of an existing jam, like an old freeze-up jam, or any kind of impediments such as bridge piers, railroad trestles, a sharp bend in a river and an oxbow, something like that, or where the river slows down, for example, if it flows into like a lake or a pond where the current slows down and the ice can pile up. Those are typical sites. And a lot of these sites in our state we do know about already. There's always a few interesting ones that form every year that we don't know about, or is a new place that occurs, but there's a lot of known places in these river channels that these occur. So it's good to keep abreast of the current conditions. So again, thermal meltout versus mechanical breakup. You definitely want the former as opposed to the latter, especially if it's some big fast event that occurs during heavy rainfall. Next slide. Okay, now to the current situation. Let's talk about the winter recap thus far, and I'll talk a little bit more of that winter spring flood outlook map I showed you right at the beginning of the presentation. Next slide. So this is just a plot of the meteorological winter so far. This is a daily plot from early November through about now. I chose Montpelier Barry Knapp Airport. You could have chosen Burlington or St. Jay or Springfield or Rutland. They're general the same, with obviously some minor differences. The one thing that's most important when you're looking at long-term trends over the winter is we really didn't have any significant thawing episodes this winter. We simply went from a very mild stretch, if you remember, through about the first week of January or early January, with very mild temperatures. We had snow, but it wasn't a lot, and we didn't have a big thing where we broke up a ton of ice. We did have some minor flooding back in December, but there was not a huge big freeze down and then big thaw. And then, as you've noticed, in the past 4 to 6 weeks, ever since we've gotten past about mid-January, early January, the temperatures have trended largely colder, especially the last week and a half, 10 days of January until now. And you can see that by these just temperature plots, more ups and downs kind of generally within the normal range. It's never, what's normal. It's always an average of everything, but generally falling within reasonable normal levels through the first half of the winter, milder a little bit, and then we've kind of trended colder recently. So then in the last 2 weeks to 3 weeks, the river ice has increased quite significantly across the area. And we've noticed that in taking some of our river ice surveys and snow survey trips the last 4 to 6 weeks. Next slide. So in terms of river ice coverage, we just had an employee go out last week, I believe Thursday, and she observed our northern watersheds. The current ice jam threat is very minimal. We don't have a lot of current big ice jams right now in place, which is a good thing across northern watersheds. The ice coverage and thickness continues to increase due to recent cold weather. There still remains open channels on the Winooski River and definitely some of the southern watersheds. The northern watersheds of the Lamoille, Passumpsic, and Missisquoi are closing up more rapidly. If not, in the Missisquoi's case, it's almost fully shut down. The overall ice coverage is nearing normal coverage across the north, maybe average to slightly below average in the south, but the thickness still remains somewhat below average for early February. We're calling it about 6 to 9 inches, maybe 6 to 12 inches now, a little bit below normal. When we look at the current threat of ice jams, it's minimal because of our cold weather and no expected ice movement. But now that we're getting a decent amount of ice coverage on the rivers, we at least have a probably near normal ice jam threat as you're looking out through March and into early April, something like that, because there's a lot of uncertainties on what could happen 4, 6, 7 weeks out in the future. Next slide. Here are our current conditions as of about 2 days ago in terms of snow depth and snow water equivalent. We've slowly been adding up and making some of those levels back closer to normals. The left map shows the snow depths. These are broad estimates. They're not perfect, but just in general, in the broad valleys, and I have New York in here because we do partner briefs to our New York constituents too, but in the Vermont valleys, the lower Connecticut River Valley and the Champlain Valley, southwest Vermont, about 8 to 18 inches of snow depth. Northeastern Vermont in the mid-slope terrain from 15 to 2,500 feet is about 15 to 25 inches. There's some variability in here. And the higher terrain above summit level, above 2,500 feet, 20 to 30 inches plus. Mount Mansfield's about 40 inches, something like that right now. And so those values have climbed back to near normal for the broad valleys, but they still remain a little bit below normal for the mid and high terrain, just because from a general lack of snowfall the first third of the winter through the first week of January, we were running quite a bit below normal. And so those higher elevations above 2,500 feet, they're still somewhat below normal for the snowpack. And those types of trends do mimic themselves in the snow water equivalents. So on the right-hand side, the water equivalent or water content and the extant snowpack. Again, in the valleys of Vermont, about 1.5 to 3.5 inches of liquid. Mid-terrain is about 2.5 to 4.5 inches of liquid. And the higher summits above 2,500 feet, 5 to 6, maybe 7 inches of liquid. Again, these values are near normal in the valleys and somewhat below normal for the mid and high terrain. Okay, next slide, please. One thing to importantly remember, though, is it's still winter. So, we're right here in the first week of February, just going into the second week of February. 35% of all of our snowfall still does fall from this point forward. Later February, March can be a very fickle and variable month. We can go through some winters where it kind of shuts down and we really don't get much. And then we've had winters where we get a lot of snow. It just depends. If we don't get a ton more the rest of the winter, we'll end up having fairly below normal winter of snowfall. If it ends up being average the rest of the year out, the trends that I just spoke about normal valley snowfall, water equivalent, and a little bit below normal higher elevations would probably hold. If we got 1 or 2 decent nor'easter type of events that are still possible through the mid to end of March, then all those values could trend above normal. So it's time to do these things. But just to point out that we still have about 1/3 of our snowpack yet to accumulate on an average year. Next slide. Wanted to throw some of these next few charts in because I do think it's important when you look at the long-term flood outlook. And again, some of these things do go into our overall assessment of how things play out. Current conditions and stream flows, just taking a look at Vermont, it's a mix of above and below normal, depending on where you are. And one thing to note about that is there's still some lingering effects of the long-term drought that started last spring and has persisted even up until now. even though we're accumulating snow and the very, very top surface parts of the soil are a little bit moist, the deeper soil layers are still somewhat on the dry side. And so that's something important to consider as we're going into the spring. So the melting of our current snowpack can certainly help recharge the moisture going into the spring. But the one thing we don't want to see is another dry spring. If we just melt the snow away come March and April and it trends very dry, we're probably going to have the drought conditions are still going to probably linger, if not increase a little bit, because you need more than just the snowpack to melt over a multi-month period. Next slide. So this is the current map of the Northeast Drought Monitor. These come out every week, every Thursday, and so you can see that across New England, and especially in Vermont and northern New York, we still have abnormally dry to low-level drought conditions. They've persisted all the way since about May or June of last year. So the improvement in the future months is heavily dependent on spring rains. And there is a capacity of soil to absorb moisture, so it may overall the lessening flood threat since it's unfrozen largely under a lot of that snowpack. But we'll have to keep that in mind, because if you do have, in the absence of some really huge heavy rainfall event, you have the capacity of the soil to absorb moisture since we have long-term dryness. So that right in the near term can be a good thing if you're thinking about, well, maybe the threat of flooding maybe is not going to be as high because it has some capacity. Long term, you still want some rains moving into spring because it's got the long-term dryness. And we're talking about other different issues outside the context of this talk, flood, water moisture, and availability to crops and things like that. Okay, next slide, please. Just a brief touch on Lake Champlain, given the long-term dryness. The red dot is the current condition. The black line is average level. We're running about a foot, foot and a half below normal. No big current or near-term threats to flooding on Lake Champlain. I don't see anything right now in the next 3 to 4 weeks that would cause any rise for concern. And normally we wouldn't anyway. I mean, the normal crest is in April and going into May. We'll have more on that as we get closer to that time period. Right now, no worries. Next slide. This is the 8 to 14 day outlooks that comes out of our Climate Prediction Center. Touched on this briefly. The long term, right now in the next 2 weeks, temperature outlooks are below normal. There's a lot of modified Arctic air across southern Canada. That's going to continue to bleed southward. Excuse me. We're not looking at anything like brutally cold, but I don't see, in looking at the most recent charts, anything that would suggest a big warm up in the next 2 weeks. So that's a good thing if you're not looking for any kind of major flooding. The 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook, and these typically kind of go hand in hand. When you get very cold in the winter, you don't get a lot of heavy precipitation. So when you get below normal, you tend to get dry and under high pressure. So there's probably going to be a lot of partly cloudy to clear nights, colder weather, but not a ton of big precipitation. Next slide. So this is the overall spring outlook summary. I gave you that slide at the beginning. The overall spring flood potential outlook right now is below normal. And when I'm talking about that outlook, this is kind of really just focusing on the next 2 weeks. Speaking of the very longer term into March, it's probably more of a near normal threat. So below normal over the next 2 weeks due to normal to below normal snowpack. I talked about that. And the expectations of seasonably cold temperatures limiting any kind of melting events. The long-term flood threat late February and especially going into March is still near normal. The current conditions are near to below normal snowpacks. The below normal snowpack again is at those higher elevations. Generally below normal river ice thickness, slightly thinner than normal given the mild early winter. The coverage though is increasing. The current greatest threat to flooding any time of year, always remember, is above normal rainfall with a sudden warm up or melting. But right now we're not seeing any of that in a future forecast that would cause us great concern that we're going to lose a lot to cause big time flooding. But it's always important to monitor future forecasts in river ice conditions because those can always change. The weather can be fickle, and we generally, the Weather Service here, have a long period of knowledge about how these things work across Vermont. But you get beyond 7 to 10 days and things can change abruptly. So it's always important to stay tuned. Okay, next slide. So that's all I have. I think I've got to about the 30-minute level here. If anybody has questions, Emily will be happy to take those for you, and she can feed them to me, and I can help answer anything. There's our telephone number. Most of you should have that. We're always in NWS chat if you want to chat with us live. And the new email address through a lot of our partner briefs are through that nwsbtvinfo@noaa.gov. I know Scott Whittier, our warning coordination meteorologist, recently sent out a solicitation email for people that want to jump on that list to get our briefs during any kind of events, whether this is a spring flood type event, a heavy snowfall event, or if it's in the summer like a severe weather event. We put those out for those as well. So that's all I have. I'll throw it back to you, Emily, for any questions that people may have.
Thank you so much, John. Okay, seeing no questions, thank you so much, John, for giving us that update. And as you mentioned, folks can email you at nwbtv.info@noaa.gov if they would like to be added to a listserv to receive updates about the weather events. Okay,
Great.
Thank you so much, John.
You're welcome.
Okay. Next, you'll be hearing from me, Vermont Emergency Management. We'll start with a presentation from me in the engagement section about the planning, training, and exercise services available to your community. And then we'll transition over to our recovery and mitigation staff to discuss their interface with FEMA to deliver federal disaster recovery and mitigation programs to Vermont communities. So I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19. So the focus of our presentations today is going to be on spring floods and ice jams, but we recognize that COVID-19 is going to play a role in your response. I ask you to please visit https://vem.vermont.gov/coronavirus for current information about response through COVID-19. The reason I refer you to this website is that this will change in the coming months, and so that website will provide you with the most up-to-date guidance. Additionally, if you're one of the top 3 points of contact on your local emergency management plan, you are invited to join us for a municipal call every Thursday afternoon. You are not one of those top 3 points of contact, but believe you should be on that municipal call, please contact your emergency management director and have them get in contact with Vermont Emergency Management to get you added to that list. A sample of a few things currently on that website that pertain to spring flooding is that schools as buildings can still be used as emergency shelters as designated in your local emergency management plans. In a situation where a shelter needs to be open, your town should make sure to use its emergency location adhering to social distancing guidelines. And also, prior to the commencement of each work shift, pre-screening, including temperature checks and a health survey, shall be required to verify each employee has no symptoms of respiratory illness, such as fever, cough, and/or shortness of breath. And then there's a link to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development guidance. So again, today, we're really going to focus just on spring flooding. If you have questions pertaining to COVID-19, please refer to that website or join us for our weekly Thursday afternoon municipal call. So your local emergency management plans, as a reminder to everyone, these are due after town meeting day, but before May 1st every year. We recognize that not every town is going to have town meeting day on the traditional town meeting day, but that's okay. As soon as March 2nd passes, you can submit your local emergency management plan and have it count towards your 2021 submission. Please remember that your local emergency management plan should include local agency and private sector stakeholders, public information and warning, local emergency operations center, including your organization as well as resourcing, list of vulnerable populations and how you would contact entities that serve those vulnerable populations, significant threats and hazards, high-risk areas, especially in light of this presentation relating to flooding and ice jams, shelter locations, your evacuation processes, and the requirement is that you both submit the municipal adoption form. That's the form that identifies your top 3 points of contact, as well as that you've adopted the National Incident Management System and you've adopted this plan, as well as the local emergency management plan. We do have regional coordinators that are here to assist. So your regional coordinators for the northwestern part of the state are Max Kennedy. Max Kennedy is actually out on military leave right now, so if you live in the northwest part of the state and need assistance, you can always contact me, Emily Harris. For the northeastern part of the state, Harry Shopman is your regional coordinator, and for the southern part of the state, Rich Cogliano is your regional coordinator. Now, these regional coordinators are available to provide you with planning assistance, training assistance, including the delivery of trainings for you, as well as planning and executing exercises. So if you have a plan in place that you'd like to exercise, we can do that, and we have been holding virtual exercises. So please get in contact with your corresponding regional coordinator to provide you with that support. Our Vermont Emergency Management Watch Officer program, just a reminder for folks, that Watch Officer is available 24/7 by calling 1-800-347-0488. And that Watch Officer is your resource coordinator for state teams, including swift water and flood response teams, as well as hazmat. We will have a presentation later today from the Division of Fire Safety, which will discuss those resources in more detail. They can also procure sandbags for you out of caches that we have throughout the state. Those are just the sandbags, not the sand or the people to fill them. And they can assist with messaging to the public, including utilizing Vermont Alert, social media, as well as press releases. Just a note about Vermont Alert for folks that aren't already familiar with it. It's a statewide all hazards alerting system. It's currently being utilized by 61 municipalities, meaning those municipalities can issue alerts to their municipality, to the folks that have registered. And there are 29,814 registered users, 156,000 residential E911 lines, and 267 business E911 lines. And what does Vermont Alert provide to subscribers? They can choose location-specific alerts based on their chosen areas. They can subscribe to specific types of alerts, timely updates about important emergency situations. For example, just prior to this training, there was a notification about a closure on 125, as well as the then reopening of Route 125. Accurate and authorized alerts pertinent to Vermonters, so the subscriber chooses which alerts they would like to receive, and the ability to prioritize notifications by specifying the order of communications type and method. For example, you can choose to receive a text message followed by an email. For more information, including registration, you can visit www.vtalert.gov. In addition, for your municipality, if you would like to get folks enrolled in this, we do have cards that we can give you. We can send those to you that you can leave out at town offices, recognizing not everyone's town offices are currently open. That's another way to alert folks to use VT Alert. One of the other roles of Vermont Emergency Management, as well as the State Emergency Operations Center during spring flooding and ice jams, is reporting damage and the current status in municipalities. We do this by utilizing our regional planning commissions, serving as local liaisons. Those local liaisons will reach out to the municipalities using those local emergency management plan top 3 points of contact to find out what's happening in your town. If you require assistance, are there roads closed? Have you experienced damage? Have you opened your emergency operations center? A whole series of questions. So please do answer that phone when they call. Regional planning commissions also coordinate with the VTrans district technicians on that damage assessment and then submit the damaged information to Vermont Emergency Management or the State Emergency Operations Center, depending if the State Emergency Operations Center is open. You should encourage your residents to contact Vermont 211 to report their residential damage information. This provides us with information that can help aid us in deciding if we're going to go to FEMA to request additional damage. And it also provides 211 with information about who might need services and how we can best support those individual residents. The state then will estimate if there's enough damage to request an emergency or major disaster declaration. And that's our segue over into recovery and mitigation. Ben Rose, are you the first one to speak from recovery?
I will be, yes.
Excellent. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, well, hello, Emily, and hello, everybody out there in Microsoft Teams land. So the next 15 minutes is going to be allocated to us, your friendly FEMA whisperers, and we're going to talk about two humongous federal grant programs. I'm going to talk about public assistance, and then Stephanie Smith, our State Hazard Mitigation Officer, is going to talk briefly about the hazard mitigation assistance programs that help communities to mitigate against future disasters. And 15 minutes means that I have 7.5 minutes to get through my 20 slides. So actually I have 7 minutes now. Ordinarily I would talk about public assistance for the next 2 to 3 days, but do I have to say beep? I do. Okay, well, okay, you've already advanced it for me, Emily. That's a good hint. So the FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide is the Bible of how the public assistance program works. And there may actually be a more updated version, but if you go to the FEMA website and search for Papa G, P-A-P-P-G, the Papa G is the rule book for FEMA public assistance. And basically it's the program under the Stafford Act whereby the federal government comes in and helps communities to recover for public infrastructure damage when there has been a catastrophic natural disaster that overwhelms local and state ability. And by the way, I noticed that there are 56 of us on this call, and most of you, I would say, are regulars, veterans, experts, but there are a few new folks sprinkled in. And so I really only got time to give you a very high-level overview of this program. This is the mini version of what you would hear during an applicant briefing when and if you have the misfortune of being part of a natural disaster, if you haven't been through 1 or 5 or 20 of them before. We have had a lot of these. We've had 18 declared disasters since 2010. Beep. So the threshold, which may change, may increase in coming years based on the current proposal by FEMA to adjust the per capita indicators. At minimum, we have to have $1 million of damage statewide to be considered for FEMA recommending to the president that Vermont receive a public assistance disaster declaration. And in addition, the damage has to be located in counties such that there is $3.89 per capita of damage in that county. So if in Chittenden County there is $300,000 of damage, that's only half of the $608,000 and change that is needed to qualify Chittenden County as a qualifying county. We have had a situation where there's almost $1 million of damage, but it's all in 1 or 2 towns in 1 or 2 counties, and some of the damage doesn't get the county to threshold. And so, you know what, I don't have time to talk about this. The bottom line is that it's really important if you do have damage to report it, because it helps to get your county to threshold, and it helps the state to get a federal disaster, which gets us 75% federal share dollars to recover. Beep. This is a quick snake or flow chart of what happens. A disaster strikes in the upper left-hand corner, kaboom. We asked the regional planning commissions to compile local liaison reports, local reports of damage from the local EMDs. We send out folks from the Agency of Transportation to help validate and quantify those damages as an estimate. That's the preliminary damage assessment. We then, based on that, ask FEMA to conduct a joint preliminary damage assessment. So they come up the next week, and we agree on damage estimates, which we then feed into a declaration request from the governor to the president. And then some indeterminate amount of time later, the president declares a disaster. Beep. And then we get a disaster fact sheet, which looks something like this. This is just an example pulled from flooding in August 2017, one of our many disasters. It specifies which counties are included. It specifies the incident period. Beep. And here's another example. This is our most recent, very special disaster, COVID-19. This is the first time in the history of the nation when all 50 states plus all the territories all have major disasters at the same time for this pandemic. Beep. So now we're back to the flow chart, and from the presidential declaration, then there's a new flow chart, which starts with us conducting applicant briefings when you get a longer version of this presentation. And then everybody gets to submit requests for public assistance, which I'll talk about. And then FEMA takes the communities through a series of steps to formulate projects, and they get to review them. The state gets to review them, and then FEMA obligates the funding to the Department of Public Safety, which is the grantee agency, and we issue sub-grant agreements to you, the sub-grantees, i.e. communities and qualifying nonprofits, and then eventually you get your federal share, beep. And again, this is all in the Papa G, but there are basically 4 building blocks for eligibility. Is the applicant eligible? Is the facility? Is the work eligible? And is the cost reasonable? Each of those steps have to be achieved, and FEMA has rules for each, beep. So the first step is actually pretty easy. It's the qualifying of the applicant. You submit a request for public assistance. This is the old school paper version. This is all online now through a system called Grants Portal, which is sort of like TurboTax for public infrastructure and emergency management managers. It's not hard. If you've done TurboTax, you can do Grants Portal. It actually gives you more visibility and control on your FEMA projects as they get developed. But step 1 is you need to know your name, your address, your phone number, your DUNS number, and a few other minor pieces of information that fit on one piece of paper. Beep. And then once you are eligible, assuming that the facilities that you are claiming damages to are facilities that you were responsible for and maintained, then the question is, what type of work is it, and is the work eligible? There are 2 flavors of work, emergency work and permanent work. Emergency work consists of category A, which is special, it's debris removal, and category B, emergency protective measures. Everything that's happening under COVID-19 falls under category B, emergency protective measures. And then usually when we have a flood or an ice storm, there's permanent work, beep. Permanent work falls into category C through G. Mostly we have category C damages because our roads and bridges are built near where floods happen. The same is actually true of our water treatment facilities of necessity. When we have something terrible like Irene, buildings flood. When we have ice storms, utilities get damages. When we have any kind of natural disaster, there's often damage to parks, recreation, and public cemeteries and things like that. So we get to experience all of these different categories, beep. There are different deadlines in the Stafford Act for emergency and permanent work. The good news is that these deadlines are soft and can be extended. We, the state, have the authority to extend the deadline for emergency work from 6 months to 12 months. And then beyond that, we can get further extensions if we need them, but we have to ask FEMA. We can't just tell FEMA. Likewise, for permanent work, the original grants are written with an 18-month period of performance. The state has the authority to extend those for an additional 30 months, which gets you to 48 months, which equals a year, 4 years rather. And then you have to ask FEMA beyond that. We are almost 10 years out from Irene, and we are in what we hope will be our last period of performance extension. Katrina is still open, to give you an idea of how hard it is to finally close the last project in a huge disaster. Beep. Okay, I'm going to only touch on this very lightly because I think Stephanie will get into it in a little more detail. But I mentioned that FEMA public assistance grants are 75% federal share typically. And the 25% share, the non-federal match, if you will, has to come from somewhere. In some states, it comes all from the locals. That an example is New Hampshire. In some states, it comes all from the state. An example is Alaska. In Vermont, we are somewhere in the middle, and we actually have this thing called the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, or ERAF, which really incentivizes communities to do certain things that will help them to be more disaster resilient. Those things are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, having up-to-date local transportation codes and standards, having a local emergency management plan, which is necessary and required for a number of reasons. And the hardest one of the four really is to have a local hazard mitigation plan. If you don't do all four of those things, then the state only matches 30% of the non-federal share. So for every $10,000 of eligible damages, the state would come up with 7.5% or $750, and FEMA would come up with $75, and FEMA would, sorry, yeah, do the math. $7,500 from FEMA, $750 from the state. If you do all four of those things, it's a 50-50 split of the non-federal share, and so on. So this is BEEP, all accessible to you at the Flood Ready website, which is a website maintained by the Agency of Natural Resources. You can go on it and learn about ERAF. You can search on your community and see your status with respect to each of the ERAF criteria. You can drill down and see the documents currently on file. You can check on how your neighbors are doing. You can watch inspirational videos of communities that have done a really good job on flood mitigation. Great website, BEEP. And last but not least, a few of culverts, some of my favorite things in the world. A lot of these got wiped out by Irene. We rebuilt many of them, bigger, better, more resilient, able to pass debris, able to pass ice, easier for fish to get up and down. This is a typical crushed old pipe culvert, BEEP. And under our current general stream alteration permit, which FEMA now recognizes as codes and standards, and therefore eligible when we have to rebuild a substantially destroyed culvert, is something that looks more like this. And obviously this is a better way of conveying water under that road, BEEP. And after Tropical Storm Irene, roughly 2/3 of the thousands of drainage structures that got destroyed and replaced got replaced with much more resilient structures, which have borne up pretty well in the many floods since then. We have lots of these stories. The bottom line takeaway for communities is that whether FEMA is involved or not, you're required to rebuild drainage structures to the standard of our state general stream alteration permit. If you aren't sure or don't know what that means or need advice, talk to your A&R river engineer and they can help you. It's always a good idea to talk to your river engineer when you're doing something in a stream, BEEP. So I don't have time to get into the details, but there's a lot of flexibility built into FEMA public assistance. You can do an improved project. You can do an alternate project. An improved project is, gee, there's never going to be a better time than this to add a bike lane along this piece of road. FEMA will allow you to build something back that's different from what was there before, as long as you're on the hook without federal assistance for the additional cost of whatever discretionary work you're doing. Likewise, you can look at a specific stretch of road and realize that the town might be better served by throwing it up and making it a trail, and you can take the money that you would have been eligible for to fix that piece of road and do something else somewhere else in town. We had a community after Irene that instead of rebuilding tennis courts that very few people were using, built sidewalks in their downtown using the alternate money. So all of these things are worth talking to us about it when you have a disaster, and we will work with you. We have a group of public assistance coordinators, many of them retired state employees who go out and help communities match up with FEMA when they do come to town so that we can get the best outcomes for communities that had damages. BEEP. That is PA 101. I think I went 9 minutes. Sorry, Stephanie. It's all yours.
That's okay. Thanks, Ben. So I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. We can go to the next slide, Emily. We always start off with this first set of slides to really make sure everyone's on the same page of what are we talking about when we say hazard mitigation. So hazard mitigation is assessing what's vulnerable and then removing that risk. So it's really a focus on what is that long-term solution. So when we have flooding damages in the state, that damage is caused because our infrastructure or our homes are getting in the way of where the river wants to be. So in this example, we remove that home from the floodplain and we've removed the future risk to that particular property. So that's hazard mitigation in a nutshell. Next slide. And we can do one more slide. Thank you. So the first step to determining what we can do to reduce that risk is really planning. So we develop plans in Vermont at the state and municipal level. This is the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which really lays the groundwork for local planning and assesses the hazards that are most likely to impact Vermont. So we're talking about flooding today, which is a significant focus of the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. We go to the next slide. But we address other hazards within this plan as well. So on the top left, there is ice jam flooding. We talk about inundation flooding and erosion, but we're also talking about things like landslide and drought and other hazards that might impact the state of Vermont. Next slide. So at the local level, municipalities are responsible for developing local hazard mitigation plans every 5 years. So that's one of the requirements for increased state funding through the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, which Ben just discussed. And this is our current map as of, I think it's as of January 1st for local plan approvals across the state. And through this local planning process, communities, you use this process to really assess what's vulnerable within your community, develop mitigation actions that reduce your risk. So what are some of those actions? Next slide. So a couple of examples here of the sort of actions that we're talking about to reduce risk. Buyouts, this is an example of a home that was bought out following Irene. We've completed about 150 buyouts in the state since Irene. And we're completely eliminating that risk because the home has been removed. The property remains in green open space for the river to access during large flood events. There's no longer vulnerability there. Next slide. Another example of project types that we do are floodplain restoration projects. So this is an example of a trail bridge in Cambridge where we replaced an undersized structure that was capturing debris and causing flooding in Jeffersonville and created new floodplain access that the river can now reach. So now we've removed that debris catchment, we've created more space for the river. Next slide. We can also do floodproofing projects. So in this case, we're keeping the building where it is, but we're limiting the damage. So now, following this event, in this particular case, there's a significant amount of water on the outside of the building. They just had to do a little bit of mopping inside the building. So we're trying to limit that risk as much as possible. Next. And a couple of other project examples. So we can upsize culverts and bridges. We've done a couple of road relocation projects in areas that are prone to erosion. We can do structural elevation projects. We can do generators in critical facilities, although the grants for those can be a little complicated. And there's funding for planning work as well. All right, next, thanks. So the community develops their plan, they're considering some of these projects and then wondering how are we going to pay for this. So next slide. So as a part of my job, I'm managing the 3 hazard mitigation grant programs, the funding programs that we have available to us. So the first one here is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is funding that follows the federal public assistance dollars that Ben discussed earlier. So this is our funding that's specifically for Vermont to do projects anywhere in the state. It doesn't have to be related to whatever the public assistance event was. So any projects across the state that reduce our vulnerability. And BRIC, this is the new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. So it was previously the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, for those of you who are familiar with that funding, but this is FEMA's large pot of annual funding. So it does typically include a certain amount of funding in what they call a set aside, so it's specific funding for each state. And then we can also access a pretty significant amount of nationally competitive funding to do larger projects in the state. This program also allows us to apply for project scoping funding, which was we just submitted our first round of applications in January under this program. And we had quite a lot of interest in the project scoping piece because it's funding so that funding you can use when you know there's a problem, you need to assess what are the possible alternatives, what might we do in this particular location, and develop engineering to then apply for a future project. So it's great to have that funding available. So I'm anticipating another round of that due in about January of 2022. And then flood mitigation assistance is the last one here. This is annual funding as well. So this also had a January deadline and will be available again next year. This is really specific to communities that are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the idea is that they're doing projects that are reducing future risk and future expenditures from the National Flood Insurance Program. So property buyouts, that sort of thing, under that pot of funding. Next slide. A couple of things to keep in mind for all of these grant programs. So it's typically a 75% federal share with a 25% local match requirement. Grants are available to municipalities and state agencies. Under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, nonprofits can apply as well, although they're not able to under the annual BRIC funding. And there are a few exceptions to this, but most of the projects require the development of a benefit cost analysis. This is something we use to show FEMA that the benefits to complete the project are outweighing the costs. So it's a specific FEMA software program that you have to go through to develop this. And for home buyouts in the special flood hazard area, we can avoid this requirement. And a BCA is not required for the project scoping applications that I discussed earlier under BRIC. I'll also note that when Ben was talking about documenting your damages, when you do have a disaster event, that's important on the public assistance side. It also becomes really important if you're going to apply for a future hazard mitigation project. So it's that information that you can use in that benefit cost analysis to show FEMA those past damages and show them that this is going to be a beneficial project to do. So if documentation is important, make sure you're keeping track of all your damages. And next slide. All right, that was quick, but I'm at my time. So I'm Stephanie, my contact information is there if you have questions on any of those funding sources or the state plan. I've also put Carolyn Massa's information up here. Caroline Massa, she's the state hazard mitigation planner who started back in December. So she's taken over the local plan review. So if you have questions on local plan review, you can reach out to her. And that's it. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Ben and Stephanie. We're now going to be joined by Shauna Clifford from the Agency of Transportation. Shauna's going to discuss the role of the district project managers and their technical staff to serve as technical resources to local town officials, as well as administering state and federal town grants. Go ahead, Shauna.
Oh. Thank you, Emily. As Emily did say, my name is Shauna Clifford, and I'm with the Vermont Agency of Transportation, District 7, which is over in the St. Johnsbury area. A main focus for our district office technical staff is to work with the towns within our service area. Town infrastructure is a vital asset, and that's why we spend a great deal of time assisting towns with preparation for a flood event, how can damages be minimized, response, recovery, so when an event happens, what needs to occur, and funding. Ben and Stephanie did talk about FEMA funding. However, there are other disaster recovery funding options. Next. So preparation. There are many opportunities for VTrans to work with towns, assessing their infrastructure, and in doing so, they identify problems. So this can be done with just general interaction with our town officials, perhaps looking at issues during our annual meeting, or they just will often give us a call at our office to go do field visits on just different issues that they're having. Other ways is the road erosion inventory. Whether this is done in conjunction with a consultant, the Regional Planning Commission, VTrans districts, conservation districts, the results are that the road erosion inventory provides the basis for evaluation of current roadway, town highway conditions. Though this inventory is primarily focused on hydrologically connected road segments, it's also a great tool to track conditions of all highway segments. By knowing what problems exist, towns can then prioritize their issues. One caveat to that is that I did mention that VTrans districts assist with road erosion inventories. I know many districts do, however, there may be a district or two that don't just because of their workload and staffing. So you can always reach out to them to find out if they can help with that or not. Districts also, we continuously promote preventative maintenance. One way we do this is by encouraging the adoption of town road and bridge standards. These were revised in 2019 and were rolled out to towns. Many of the towns have adopted these newest version. Overall, by towns adopting the road bridge standards, they have enhanced overall flood resiliency to their infrastructure. It allows for mitigation opportunities in the event of a disaster, as Ben and Stephanie both discussed. And it also provides the municipal roads general permit compliance to the hydrologically connected road segments, as well as compliance to the stream alteration standards. Lastly, know your contacts. Who do you call for when you need assistance? So there are many resources out there and available, such as the VTrans districts, the regional planning commissions, Vermont local roads, conservation district staff, better road staff. So whenever you have a question about how best to prepare, you can call any one of these entities to help guide you through the process. Next. Response and recovery. VTrans may be notified of damages in a number of ways. It could be by the RPC, Vermont Emergency Management, calls from the general public, or by the towns themselves. Once notified, our role is to assist the town in their recovery efforts. Our staff will go out and perform damage assessments or preliminary damage assessments. So basically, where are the damages? Are they on a federal aid highway or class 4 town highway? Either one of those situations could change the way funding happens. What is the severity of damages? Depending on the answer to this question, a town may require assistance in obtaining additional resources such as materials, whether it's that they need culverts or additional gravel sources. They could need additional equipment. Do they have a bridge go out? They may need temporary bridge or contractors to erect a temporary bridge. Districts will also help with the technical assistance. We can provide repair details or plans, scope of work, request for proposals. We also will help with the documentation for towns. Regardless of the funding source, proper documentation is key. You need pictures, you need measurements, and they need to be organized in a way that you can easily get the reimbursement. And then, are there any additional funding sources for the impacted communities? And as you will see, there are. Next. So the Emergency Relief Program, or the Federal Highway FHWA ER program, the eligibility for that program is that the damage has to be a direct result of a natural disaster. And the damaged highway either has to be a rural major collector or an urban collector or higher in an federal aid urban area. The overall disaster eligibility threshold is 700,000. So that's collectively throughout the state. That includes damages to the state infrastructure as well as the eligible routes on the town system. The per site repair cost threshold is a bit different than FEMA. It's a minimum of $5,000. And there are two types of work with the Federal Highway ER funding. There's emergency repairs, which are basically the repairs that are undertaken immediately after the disaster to restore essential traffic, to minimize the extent of the damages, and to protect the remaining facilities. This work is done within the first 180 days. And first 180 days starting with the date of the letter of intent for the disaster. So basically when we request the disaster to Federal Highway. This work is 100% federal funding. And then there's the permanent repairs. These repairs are the ones that are done to restore the highway to the pre-disaster condition. And this work is anything that's after the 180 days. And the funding split is a little bit wonky, if you want to say that. It's 81.08% federal, 8.92% state, and 10% town share. Next. The other funding source we have is the Town Highway Emergency Fund. This is 100% state money, so there's no federal money with this. It has to be basically a non-federal disaster, although there are instances where we have used the Town Highway Emergency Fund to basically facilitate or fund projects that either FEMA or federal highway would not cover. In order to qualify for this pot of money, the damages have to meet a certain deductible, and that deductible is 10% of a town's non-winter maintenance budget. So as long as a town's damages exceed that, then they would be eligible for the Town Highway Emergency Fund. And then the reimbursement is going to be based on the greater of either a 90% of your the cost or that 10% of your non-winter maintenance budget. A little bit, like I said, wonky, and certainly your district project manager technicians could help you through the process if that was a funding source that was available. Next. So who do you contact? There are 8 districts, and each district has a project manager and their technical staff. Basically, all of their contact information is there. So please feel free to reach out to any one of us, whether it's through phone or email, and we can certainly help you through an event. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we don't have anything this spring.
Thank you so much, Shauna.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. We'll now move over to the Agency of Natural Resources. Agency of Natural Resources will discuss the who to call and what permits are needed when working in streams and floodplain. We're going to start with Jaron Borg, followed by John Broker Campbell. Jaron?
Am I coming through okay?
You are, Jaron.
Okay. So, as mentioned, my name's Jaron Borg. I am a river management engineer for the Central District of Vermont. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about stream alteration permitting, preparedness in response to ice jams, and spring flooding. I'm going to go over a little bit about ice jams and then some more general emergency protective measures that can be taken in response to flooding threats. So to start off, just to give you an idea of the scale of some of these projects we deal with, or ice jams that we deal with, this is a photo taken in Montpelier, right on the Berlin line, and that's an ice jam that started down in Middlesex. So this is about a 2.5 mile long ice jam. Go to that next slide. So as that first slide demonstrated, ice jams are not necessarily easy to deal with in scope or location, at least when you get to the ones that tend to affect houses the most. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see ice jam during that 2018 melt and freeze up event that John mentioned in the first presentation, and then again a month later in the Lamoille River as well. So the scale, again, we're talking about a couple miles of dammed up stream in these instances where it can be quite difficult to deal with. The scale on the ice jam in the Missisquoi really was not manageable and would have been much more cost effective to replace damaged buildings and infrastructure than try and go and remove the entirety of this ice jam. As far as location difficulties, while this photo of the Guyon or Guyon, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, was taken from Route 15 in Johnson, We know that the majority of the water is not actually in that channel. You see, it's actually in the field off to the right-hand side, but it is all iced over. So there's some real difficulties with accessing this area to try and unjam this particular section. And then in the background of the photo, it's actually dammed up on the Lamoille as well. So that is just one of the realities that we have to deal with. Both of these jams cause some severe inundation flooding, but it's not the only issue to be concerned about with ice flows. If we can go to the next slide. Next slide.
You should be seeing ice scour Winooski River.
Here we go. Okay. So we do also have ice scour issues. So the actual size of these ice chunks can provide some difficulties with hardened infrastructure. This is damage in the town of Moortown, again on the Winooski River, and you can see an area of slope that has been eroded and subsequently stabilized in a temporary manner, and that was eroded due to an ice jam on the right-hand side of the river. And actually scouring out on the left-hand side. So there was some sizable material here in that 2 to 4 foot range that was removed just because of the mass of the ice chunks. While this particular repair is temporary in nature, it was permitted as such, and subsequently was repaired with larger Type 4 material to meet the stream alteration standards, as well as to return that road to a 2-lane traffic. So if we can go to the next slide. There are a few things that can be done to prepare for ice jams. John again mentioned that a lot of these jams occur repeatedly in the same area due to either a change in the slope of the stream, so big, broad sections of stream where the flow is very shallow, often are sources of ice jamming, as well as some tight constrictions in the river, tight bends. That was the case in the in the Lamoille River up in Johnson, and again the case in Montpelier, where you can see this photo was taken. The town of Montpelier is pretty proactive due to some historic ice jams that have caused a lot of issues, and they actually have a contractor stage a long stick excavator towards the tail end of where the ice jams have occurred in the past, so they can go in and remove material as they're starting to form, hopefully to push them along. But that's not always feasible. Pretty fortunate that this is close to a road, although it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So that's it for this slide. We can move on to the next one. It's a little more general regarding the types of permitting that can be done. So actual removal of ice material, we do not regulate with stream alteration. We consider that water, even though it is a solid at the time of removal, we do not consider it a flood deposit. But for removal of flood deposits and other issues that are affecting improved properties and infrastructure, we have a series of emergency protective measures and responses that can be conducted. These are measures that can be done without direct authorization from the stream alteration program, but must be done under the guidance of the town select board or someone who's been delegated the responsibility of public safety by the select board. So oftentimes that's road foremen and emergency managers. The practices that can be taken are removal of flood deposits. So if you have a stream that's choked off a bridge, in this case, with woody debris or gravel, that's a possibility, as well as protection of stream banks that are eroding against infrastructure with material or stabilizing infrastructure. Again, then we have a couple more temporary measures if they're conducted in accordance with this. It would be temporary berms to reduce inundation flooding of structures, and also temporary culvert crossings where the road needs to be open for public safety. We do allow undersized structures to go in on a temporary basis only. All of these do need to come up to performance standards under the stream alteration general permit, but there is a timeline to do so. And we also require follow-up documentation to be submitted within 60 days of action being taken, and the action also needs to be notified to the Rivers program within 72 hours of the start of actions. To do so, we have a web reporting form that can be found on the River Management Program's website. And you see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a few radio buttons: Contact Rivers Web Form, Public Notice page. In the middle, there is an Emergency Protective Measures button. And if you were to click on that, it's going to ask for the municipality, the nature of the threat, what infrastructure is being threatened, as well as the measures that were taken to mitigate that threat. And I think that's about it as far as these go. Eventually, you will need to come up to the stream alteration permit standards. Although those can be done initially if the river management engineer has been contacted. They can issue a next flood measure for emergency protections, but those do need to meet standards under the general permit initially. So to reach out to your local engineer, we have a map here showing the districts. Most towns will know who their river management engineer is already if they do have substantial infrastructure next to rivers, which is where we'd expect to be responding to in the case of spring flooding. And that ends it for stream alteration. From here on, we are going to defer to my colleague John Broker-Campbell to speak a little bit about floodplain permitting.
Sure. Thanks, Jaron. So just real quick, you can see that you will likely need a permit from both the river management engineer and likely your local floodplain administrator in your community. There are flood hazard areas, river corridors, floodways, all of these things that towns should be aware of when recovering from a flood event or a storm event. So there's municipal permits, there's certain projects that are jurisdictional to the state floodplain rules, so state roads and bridges. There's also projects jurisdictional to Act 250, large development projects in Section 248, so power generation. So all that said, it's likely that you will need a permit for work in or near the stream. Next slide. So for communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, and if you are unsure whether your community participates, you can check the Flood Ready website that Ben referenced earlier, and it'll kind of tell you whether you're in and the number of structures, within the flood hazard area within your community. Most most towns participating in the flood insurance program have adopted bylaws that are compliant and require a permit for development within the flood hazard area. And in the National Flood Insurance Program, development is defined as any man-made change to the landscape. So culvert replacements, bridges, they might require a conditional use permit, so kind of a longer permitting process with more development, more information required. They may say, oh, you're just replacing, a 16-inch culvert with an 18-inch culvert, so we can just administratively permit that. But either way, you will need a permit for that. And it's important that the town enforce their local regulations so they can stay compliant and so folks can purchase flood insurance for their structures if they choose. Next. So I just wanted to be real quick. There are five regional floodplain managers across the state. You can see the map there on the right. That can also be found on the DEC Rivers Program webpage. Again, my name is John Broker-Campbell. I'm the blue on the map for the southern part of the state, but please contact your local floodplain administrator or your regional floodplain manager for DEC if you have questions about permitting or need technical assistance in terms of determining whether you'll need a permit or what information may be required. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John and Jaron. We are now joined by Colonel Randy Gates, representing the Vermont National Guard. From airlifting to sandbags and everything in between, Vermont National Guard is a state partner in disaster preparedness and response. Randy will speak to the military support, as well as their organizational capabilities and established procedures for requesting Guard resources and how to obtain Guard resources through Vermont Emergency Management. With that, go ahead, Randy.
Thank you, Emily. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that you've been able to take part in this annual endeavor to best understand emergency preparedness with regards to the potential of flooding in the spring. And the Vermont National Guard has a significant piece in that, should the situation warrant it. I think the most important thing that I would like you to get out of the slides that I'll present is that there's a process to ask for our help. We're very much in the communities, but if a resource is needed from the Vermont National Guard, for example, Emily was talking about sandbags earlier, but they don't provide the sand nor they provide the manpower. Well, we provide the manpower and a sandbag machine as well, but there's a process to request those, and that's through the Vermont Emergency Management office. So even if you know someone here in Camp Johnson and state leadership, for example, and you're friends with them and you think that that could be an easy way to get a resource, please don't do that. Please go through Vermont Emergency Management. So next slide. So it's important for everyone to understand also just what is this thing called the National Guard. You know, we are a reserve of the active component along with the United States Army Reserves, but we have a different organization to some extent, and we also have a different commander-in-chief. With the National Guard, it's respective governors, where the United States Army Reserves and the active component, the commander-in-chief, is the president. So there are the three different missions that we have. We have a federal mission, and you can read that there, where it's staffing and training equipment combat units. Basically, if it's painted green and is here at Camp Johnson, it belongs to the federal government. We can use it under state response, but there's usually a reimbursement requirement. And then you can see our state mission, which is providing trained and equipped units to protect life and property in order to preserve peace, order, and public safety upon the direction of the governor. An example of that might be the preparation we did for the demonstrations we thought that were going to happen up recently at the State House. We had a number of units prepped to respond to a support request from the Vermont State Police. And then finally in the community, and that's to participate in local and state programs that add value to our communities. And an example of that might be our engineer battalion doing a readiness project, like putting in a soccer field at a local community or something like that. Next slide, please. So when we look at disaster response preparation here in the Guard, we understand that local communities need to be the first responders. And if they've run out of resources, if you will, to bring to bear to whatever novel crisis is happening, they look to the state. And if the state runs out of resources, then they look to the federal government. We have a part in all of those things. My job as the Director of Military Support is to be the senior liaison officer to Vermont Emergency Management, and I fulfill a coordination role at the State Emergency Operations Center during partial and full activations. There's also a couple of things on the right-hand side to understand and remember when it comes to preparation for disaster, if you will, and that's the individual preparation that families can do, and then non-government organizations doing stuff. Now, we're not, we're a tiny state, so we don't have a lot, but there are a number of non-government organizations in sister states in the area that have a presence, that has the ability, that have the ability to muster people and other resources to respond. Next slide, please. We use this slide here to show the planning that we do when we go to two national coordination workshops for the National Guard. One is the DOM Ops, or Domestic Operations Workshop, out at Fort Carson, Colorado. That's usually in November. This past year, it was canceled because of COVID-19. But what we do with this coordination workshop is I've done a gap analysis, and we'll talk about this in subsequent slides, but I've done a resource gap analysis within the Vermont National Guard. And for those things that I can't find that I have enough of here in Vermont, then I start looking to other states, other National Guard units. For example, if we wanted a temporary bridge to fix or to replace one that's been washed away, perhaps, I know that my closest multi-role bridge company within the National Guard, there's 11 of these specialized units in the country, but the closest one is in the Connecticut National Guard. So my job would be to coordinate the shipment of that resource, if you will, for use here in Vermont. But one of the things that we have to be aware of is that, the thing that we worry about most here in Vermont, or at least the one that I worry about most to respond to, is a hurricane. We see a hurricane coming out a week early, a week ahead of time, if you will, and depending on the path that's projected by the National Weather Service, I'll know if Maine and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Massachusetts can respond to my request. Now, it's unlikely that Massachusetts and Connecticut would be able to respond because the hurricane would be going through their states in order to get to us. When we responded to Hurricane Irene, we had response from 6 different states, as far south as South Carolina and as far west as Ohio. So I have to find where these resources are, and then I have to make these prearranged agreements so that when an emergency management assistance compact is initiated by the state, we've done a lot of the legwork already. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things that the Vermont National Guard is capable of doing, and the things that I've done in red are the things that we did during Irene. We have a civil disturbance operations capability that was brought to bear in our planning here in state, and the 103 soldiers that we've sent down as part of an augmented force at the Capitol, and they're still fulfilling that security mission today as we speak. So we do community liaison, we do all the things that you can see on there. Now, I have a lot of this, I have a lot of capability, but I don't have a lot of capacity. So some of these things are in pretty short supply. Engineering at the very bottom there on the left-hand side, we've actually gone through some force structure changes in the Vermont National Guard where we've gained a battalion but lost the company. Now, our 131st Engineer Company was a horizontal construction company, very useful for repairing roads, and they had heavy equipment such as excavators and things like that. They've converted their mission to a combat engineer role where those equipment pieces aren't part of their equipment mix, if you will. So we've got more engineers, but they're not the type that we necessarily need during a disaster response. Next slide, please. So this slide sort of gives you a better understanding of the gap analysis that we've done. And the methodology behind this is actually changing. You can see on the far left there what we call a tickler chart. And you see at the very top where it says Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's the intensity of a category storm hurricane. The host for our second national conference every year is the Louisiana National Guard, and the conference is in New Orleans and has grown out of a Gulf state coordination workshop where it was just the Gulf states talking about moving assets around. Well, that has matured into a 54 state and territory coordination workshop. And for the northern states, a category storm intensity scale doesn't really quite describe what we have. So we're trying to tie it more into NIMS definitions over the next year or so. But regardless, it shows you on that far left column all the things that the Vermont National Guard can do. We call it the NGB 10+1, one being the new capability of cyber response. And then you can see in green where I've got enough capability in state. When it goes to yellow, and specifically when it goes to red, that's when I go from figuring out where I have these things myself to going out of state. And you can see on the fourth column the middle column, if you will, where it says EMAC providers. Those are all the agreements that I've had informal with other states. So our farthest away agreement is with the Texas National Guard, and our closest is with New Hampshire and New York. So we look at what we need. I've described it in the EMAC requirement, and then we go after the state that we know can provide the resource. And then the second column for the far right, where it's got EMAC exportable, those are the things that I can do that I've got a little bit of excess of. And then that last column is commitments that we've made. So understand that there's a lot of capability out there during storm recovery, transportation, communications, aviation, logistics, engineering. Those are all big parts of our response puzzle, if you will. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are just some pretty cool pictures of missions, not all happening here in Vermont. You heard about all the wildfires out in the West this past year. Well, that was a whole of nation response by our different guard. And Vermont National Guard contributed a couple of logisticians things to that, but other than that, we didn't really have much capability beyond that, what they wanted. Next slide, please. So some of these pictures are in our response to Irene, the one in the upper right-hand corner with the Chinook helicopter that was moving what we call class 1 supplies or water to some of those communities that were needing those supplies during Irene recovery. Next slide, please. And we do have high water vehicles that are specifically designed and engineered for high water traverse. This is an example of, on the right-hand side, a light medium tactical vehicle or LMTV. We have those throughout the state and they're useful for evacuation operations. Next slide, please. We do debris removal as well, mostly chainsaw work, and that is to clear those roads that are main supply routes, usually routes to some other resource such as a hospital or something like that. It's not us competing out there with Davey Tree Service and doing all the work. It's just immediate relief of and removing debris for those specially designated routes that have been given to us. Next slide, please. These are a couple pictures from Irene recovery. Next slide, please. Again, this was blue skies over Camp Johnson the day after Irene, and this is moving the supplies. We do have helicopter assets available. Actually, that's a pretty costly way to move water, but that was part of our response. Next slide, please. We do snow removal. We had a mission several years ago to help Boston out when it got a number of storms back to back to back, and we can do augmentation of search and rescue efforts as well. Next slide. So this slide just gives you a quick primer on authorities and restrictions. It's always important to understand that we don't move anything in Vermont without being tasked by someone already, which is in almost all cases Vermont Emergency Management. Now, in a time of COVID-19, we're also doing a lot of support to the Vermont Department of Health, but we take our direction from civilian authorities, and that includes the prioritization of the capability that we bring to whatever efforts been undertaken by the state. So the military fills in civilian response capability gaps, so we add to the mix, if you will. And we can add for a short time the capacity to response for response and recovery. It's important to understand, though, and I made a little comment earlier, if it's painted green, it belongs to the big army, and we have a reimbursement expectation, or there could be, for the use of our soldiers, airmen, and equipment pieces. And that's usually advised to that civilian incident commander pretty quickly in the discussion of us coming to help out. Next slide, please. That was pretty quick in a couple of quick slides. Emily has my email address to forward to anybody that wants it. I can give you a much longer presentation by sending you some additional slides, or I can come to your organization and give a more detailed brief if that's advantageous to you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much, Randy. Just a reminder, any questions, please enter them into the chat or raise your hand. Of note is all presenters' email addresses are actually at the end of this presentation, so you will have one final slide that will be all the contact information for the folks you've seen today. Now move over to the Division of Fire Safety, where we're going to be joined by Robert Sponable, Michael Greenya, Patrick McLaughlin, and Mike Cannon to discuss the role and resources of the Division of Fire Safety, including fire and building inspectors, electrical inspectors, plumbing inspectors, and community risk reduction outreach programs. They'll discuss how municipalities can request these services and how they intermesh with local incident command systems, and an overview of what a municipality can expect as a result of the Division of Fire Safety's response. With that, Robert Sponable, I believe you're up first.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everybody. Bob Sponable, Division of Fire Safety Deputy Director. One of the most important things that I'd like to get across to all of our community partners, our municipal partners, is that the Division of Fire Safety has a wide range of assets that we can assist the communities with. And we can do that prior to an incident, during an incident, and after an incident. And as we work through these slides, we will be able to show you exactly how we can assist in those different time frames as far as a disaster is concerned. Next slide. So the Division of Fire Safety provides numerous services related to the safety of residents. It ranges from code enforcement to public education, fire service training, hazmat response. Fire investigators work closely with the state police, and of course our urban search and rescue team. And it's our goal to maximize life safety and property conservation. And it's important that we're able to work with the communities, the local communities, to be that important tool in the toolbox. For the communities that don't have the resources immediately available to them, and we can certainly go and help out. And we work closely with your emergency management directors, your local fire chiefs, your local law enforcement, your local EMS. We work hand in hand with them at every level to help mitigate the situation that's there. Next slide. And of course, we're made up of special operations, and we are going to just do a quick overview of those opportunities that the local communities have and the resources available to them by the Division of Fire Safety. We work to mitigate the effects of flooding in populated areas, and we like to introduce. We would like to introduce ourselves before the big event. That helps us identify any issues that may arise during an event, such as the identification of shelters, warming centers, things like that. We certainly want to make sure that where we are able to house people during the time of disaster is in a safe and protected situation. So we want to have that outreach beforehand and during the event. We have the ability to respond with our urban search and rescue, our swift water rescue teams, our hazmat team. And then after the incident, we're going to assist the communities with the code enforcement activities and identifying structures that have been damaged and what needs to be done to bring them back to a livable or usable condition. And we also are very, very supportive of and offer up a MARC system, which is a multi-agency recovery center, which we've used in the past and has worked out quite well. Next slide. So now I'll introduce you to the chief of our state hazmat team, Patrick McLaughlin.
Thanks, Deputy Director. Like Bob said, my name is Pat McLaughlin. I took over the Vermont State Hazmat team from Todd Cosgrove, who retired in September of 2020. Todd was an original member of the Vermont State Hazmat team and brought it to where it is today, which is a elite Type 1 FEMA hazmat team with capabilities to respond throughout the state to mitigate a good amount of biological, chemical, radiological emergencies that local municipalities may find, along with our partners at the National Guard and other private entities that have hazmat capabilities. We also work closely with lots of our municipal partners who have decon units and trailers. Like most agencies in the response world, last year was a difficult year for in-person training. We use our hands a lot to mitigate these hazards, and we moved to the virtual world, and we're able to continue our response throughout last year, whether that be hazmat or assisting local entities throughout the state. Just a quick brief of last year, we responded to 134 incidents. 34 of those were response, 67 were merely notifications, and 33 were phone consults. The state hazmat team maintains a fleet of 4 trucks. One recently moved to Colchester, an AOT, one at Barnet at the fire station, one at the Putney Fire Station, and one at the Vermont Fire Academy. If you ever need any assistance with Vermont State Hazmat, the Hazmat hotline is answered 24/7, 365, and that's 1-800-641-5005. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to you, Deputy Director.
Next slide, please. So now I'll turn it over to Mike Cannon, our program manager for the Urban Search and Rescue Team.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Welcome. 2 quick slides. The State Urban Search and Rescue Team has a flood swiftwater response, and we are on a good day 90 strong. And we can go out the door with about 35 folks to meet a FEMA NIMS Type 3 Urban Search and Rescue Team. We are housed in Colchester, Vermont currently with a component of the state hazmat team. And we have 60 of those 90 members trained in swiftwater flood response. Our team itself has 4 boats, 2 trailers. We can either go out the door as a 1 large Type 1 swiftwater asset to a community, which is about 14 to 20 people, or we could break those teams up, or that team up into 2 smaller Type 2, Type 3 teams to maneuver ourselves around the state as the needs to serve those needs. We also share, and go on to the next slide if you would please, MOUs with 10 other partner agencies in the state of Vermont that have swiftwater flood assets, and those are geographically located in some of the areas of the state that have been identified as being high-risk areas. Those teams range from Type 1 swiftwater teams, so those are the 14 people teams, down to Type 3 and 4 teams with usually 1 boat and about 5 or 6 swiftwater technicians that can assist communities. Those teams are activated through the VEM Watch Officer 1-800 number. And those teams are vetted through our program, through the state Urban Search and Rescue program, through their training requirements and equipment. And those MOUs are reevaluated. I'd like to say on an annual basis, but they're really not on an annual basis. But they are reevaluated through the operations section chief over at Vermont Emergency Management. We are in an initiative this year with Homeland Security funding to try to improve the swiftwater response for the state of Vermont. And through that grant process, through a 5-year initiative, we hope to increase or at least better some of those teams with an additional 20 boats and 10 trailers, as well as some training to better meet the flood response issues that we have in some of the areas of the state. Our USAR team, if requested, that is a kind of a Swiss Army knife type tool, the way I describe it. It comes with everything. We have 6 components of that team that range from rescue to logistics. We have physicians and paramedics. We have hazardous materials technicians. The team comes with a variety of search equipment, from technical search cameras to search canines for locating surviving victims or injured victims in collapsed structures or wide area search areas that might have been devastated from flooding or some type of a weather event. That team can be requested through the 800 number through the Vermont Emergency Management Watch Officer program. Thank you.
Next slide. So this is a really quick slide that I just want to let folks know that we do have that concerted effort with the Vermont State Police as far as fire investigations go, and we can assist any of the local fire departments. Most of the fire departments are aware of how to request our services, and that's just one more facet that the division can help the local communities during the time of disasters and flooding and other situations. Next slide, please. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce Mike Grenia. He is our Assistant State Fire Marshal, and he's in charge of our public education section. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to cover a couple of different topics that Bob kind of hit on a little bit earlier. The first slide here that we're talking about is that our normal fire marshals that are out and about on a daily basis can be called upon to provide technical assistance at pretty much any event. There's, electrical inspectors and fire marshals and stuff like that that can really assist either fire service or emergency situations. Next slide, please. During the flooding events, a lot of times our folks are involved in some rapid building assessment. And this is basically deploying a couple folks from our offices in teams to rapidly look at a building to make sure that it's safe for people to be inside. Next slide, please. One of the high points here that a lot of folks don't realize is that we can go into single-family homes during a declared disaster, and there is a order that is available to municipal folks to condemn a building, and that's mainly if it's beyond repair and it's a total loss. Some of those things can be used in that manner. Next slide. We use a rating system when we're looking at buildings. You can see the different traffic light colors here that we use. For an unsafe building, which means that there's a situation there where it's really unsafe for anybody to be inside. That could be a structural issue. That could be, spilled material that's hazardous or stuff like that. The yellow, limited, that's sometimes has more definition on the permit or on the tag itself, talking about the limits that are there. So it's sometimes we're able to have people go inside for cleanup work. Other times it's not possible. And then the last one there is the green inspected tag. That means everything's been looked at and is okay. Next slide. And this is the copy of the condemned order, building that that is condemned. Again, that's available for municipal building inspectors, local health officers, a fire marshal, a zoning administrator. They're all able to declare a building that is, like I said, beyond repair. The key point is that a disaster has to be declared for those folks to have that condemned power, and that's right in the state statute. A copy of that order is available at the website there that you can download and use for that purpose. Next slide. We did talk a little bit about what happens with our offices during a disaster. One of those things is we set up an emergency operations center in our main office, or possibly at the fire academy or other areas of the state, depending on where it's happening and stuff like that. That's mainly for coordinating the efforts of our fire marshals and building inspection teams and stuff like that. It does provide a link from the field up to the SEOC and back and forth. A lot of times that is operations type of an EOC, so they're coordinating the operations that are happening in the field with the inspections. Next slide. One of the other pieces is we talked about earlier is disaster shelters, and it's really, the Red Cross has many different shelters that are already set up, and those are kind of pre-approved and may just need a quick walkthrough. They have a pretty good system set up in place where they really go through and check off those things when they're putting one together, pre-planning. The issue that comes up quite a bit is when we set up local shelters. And like Bob said, we'd like to look at those places beforehand so we don't have to do it during the heat of the moment and when the disaster is happening. Next slide. And then we have our MARC, the Multi-Agency Resource Center. This is set up kind of based off the FEMA type of post-disaster setup, where they come in and they have a one-stop shop for folks to come in and talk about recovery and those types of things. We kind of do that at a state level also through emergency management, with numerous partners in the room that folks can go to be able to get information or ask questions, or maybe get some resources. Maybe they need food or something like that nature, or different places. So next slide. I think we skipped one, didn't we? No, I'm sorry. So this is our regional offices. We're pretty much have the state divided into quarters, and then our main office is in the central part of the state, along with our fire academy and many other regions. The regional offices are a resource for folks, especially if they have issues for normal operations during the day, or if the fire department has to respond to a situation in town and they have questions on building issues or or have to provide smoke detection or carbon monoxide detection because there's none there. The regional offices can be a resource for that. Next slide. And that pretty much finishes up for us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mike. Now, just a reminder to folks to please enter into the chat any questions that you have for the Division of Fire Safety, including Michael Grenia, Bob Sponable, Mike Cannon, or Patrick McLaughlin. In the chat, Mike Bard has a question. It says you are urban search and rescue. What is the delineation for rural areas? Does state police and or game wardens take over there? Mike? Mike Cannon?
Oh, yes, Emily, I am still here. Don't worry. Yes, there is a wilderness search and rescue aspect as well. It's run through various wilderness teams throughout the state, and those are geographically kind of located around some of the major mountaintops that we have with some of the hiking trails. And but that request goes in through state police for wilderness search and rescue, and Neil Van Dyke is the search and rescue coordinator for Department of Public Safety.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. And for everyone's awareness, in the chat, I did throw up the 1-800 number for the VEM Watch Officer. It's 1-800-347-0488. You can always contact that number 24/7 to reach any one of these entities. We'll now move over to Bruce Melendi from the Regional Planning Commissions to talk about the role of Regional Planning Commissions serving as a partnership with Vermont Emergency Management and other agencies in updating local emergency management plans, coordinating emergency management training and exercises, and providing technical assistance on grant programs, including the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. Thank you, Bruce.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. As Emily mentioned, my name is Bruce Melendi. I'm the Emergency Management Coordinator for Northeastern Vermont Development Association. That is the Regional Planning Commission that serves Caledonia, Essex, and Orleans counties. We have a map here showing where the Regional Planning Commissions are located throughout the state. And there's information there on how to contact your Regional Planning Commission. The good thing about going last is a lot of people have already touched on some of the things that we do, but I'll just provide a little more information. As Emily indicated, one of the things that regional planning commissions do is we work with all of our towns to keep their local emergency management plans updated. Here at NVDA, I have 52 communities in my area, and a lot of them are very rural, so I do really most of the work to help them get those plans updated. And we also work with the regional coordinator. As Emily mentioned, there are 3 regional coordinators from Vermont Emergency Management. Harry Shopman is the one that works in our area. And we work with Vermont Emergency Management to coordinate trainings and exercises for the towns in our area, as well as for first responder agencies. And also we do drills and exercises with hospitals. I have 2 in my area, North Country Hospital up in Newport and Northeastern Vermont Regional Hospital here in St. Johnsbury. We work on grant programs, state and federal. We provide technical assistance to communities as well as first responder agencies in that area. As Stephanie mentioned, one of the grants that's really difficult sometimes to secure is a generator grant, but I've been fortunate to get a couple of those secured for communities in our area. We also do the work with towns to be in compliance with the ERAF, which Ben Rose talked about, the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. As Ben indicated, the hardest thing to keep updated is the local hazard mitigation plans. Those are required to be updated every 5 years. And we have people here at NVDA, including myself, that work with towns to get hazard mitigation plans adopted and approved by FEMA. We have a transportation planner here at NVDA, as does every regional planning commission that works to help keep towns updated with their road and bridge standards. And we also work with towns to help them come into compliance for the NFIP program. And as I mentioned, I work closely on the LEMPs, which those are the 4 components that make up the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund requirements. We do work closely with ALT, as Shauna Clifford indicated. Here at NVDA, I feel we have a really good working relationship with ALT, because when there is a weather-related emergency, what we try not to do is duplicate each other's efforts. So if I'm reaching out to a local town to see if they have any damages, I will include my local ALT reps in that, so they can see what the response is, and they do the same with us. So we're not duplicating efforts, and we're all aware of what's going on in our area communities. When there is an incident, each regional planning commission is required to provide 3 local liaisons that can either reach out to the communities during these incidents, or to work at the State Emergency Operations Center, which I have done many times since I started at NVDA. And we also work with our local emergency planning committees. I have 9 and 10 in my area. So those are some of the things that we do here in the regional planning commissions. And I think that covers a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about.
Excellent. With that, does anyone have any questions for Bruce Melendi, functioning as a representative of the regional planning commissions? And with that, thank you so much for taking the time today to participate in our annual Spring Flood Seminar. Please reach out to anyone with questions that you may have. By working together, we can prepare and make sure that we reduce the impact of future flooding in Vermont. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.